5 rounds chambered in his rifle, Constable Charan Das stood watch on Srinagar's Navakadal bridge, guarding himself against the bitter February cold with a small fire lit with the remnants of a wooden crate. He paid no attention to the 2 men who walked up through the darkness of the night until their daggers pierced his chest. The border security force guard crawled through the snow for a few meters, his lungs fighting for air, before he died. Later on the night of February 3, 1967, a clerk at the Maharajganj police station wrote up First Information Report 21, recording the murder. 50 years ago this month, India destroyed Al-Fatah, the terrorist network responsible for Das's killing, but almost without firing a single shot. Figures on the fringes of that terrorist network became pillars of the Kashmir establishment. Former Deputy Chief Minister Muzaffar Beg, respected political leader Bashir Ahmad Kichlu, highly regarded Inspector General of Police Javed Makhdoumi. As New Delhi considers its next steps in Kashmir, holding elections, exploring its options with Pakistan through a back-channel dialogue that's now going on, the story of the Master Cell and Al-Fateh hold out important lessons. Fighting terrorism, it shows, isn't all guts and glory. Quiet politics can be as much of a lethal weapon as bullets. I want to tell you the story today of another Forgotten Kashmir File and what it tells us about India's options in Kashmir. In the summer of 1964, months before the Second India-Pakistan War, Islamabad threw its weight behind a new covert network founded by Ghulam Sarwar, Hayat Mir, Ghulam Rasool Zagir and Zafarul Islam. The network was called the Master Cell by Indian intelligence. It drew heavily on educated elites, especially medical students and engineers. This youth cohort was alienated by New Delhi's appointment of proxies in place of elected governments. They were seduced by secessionism. The crossing of the line of control, wrote the would-have-been insurgent Nazir Gilani, was as mystical for a Kashmiri youth as the Eve of Saint Agnes. What was the Eve of Saint Agnes? Well, there's a European folklore story where young women perform divinatory rituals to get a vision of their to-be husbands on that night. As war raged through the summer of 1965, these networks positioned themselves as a revolutionary vanguard, fighting in support of Pakistani troops and irregulars. Grenades were thrown in Srinagar's Regal Chowk and Lal Chowk, bridges burnt, pamphlets showered on streets. In the mountains of central Kashmir's Badgam, Hayat Mir even set up a parallel government, running Islamic courts, which on one occasion executed a supposedly promiscuous woman. A grocer's goods were looted and distributed to the rural poor. Even after the 1965 war ended though, the network hoped to keep up its terror campaign. Equipped with explosive left behind by retreating Pakistani forces, bombings were conducted across Kashmir. The cells drew up plans to assassinate Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister Ghulam Muhammad Sadiq and Home Minister D.P. Dhar. The underground cells had succeeded in creating a fairly strange situation in the valley, wrote the legendary police officer Surendra Nath, who would go on to serve in the northeast as well as violence-torn Punjab. With the training received by 2 members of the cell, which they would have imparted to other members, and with the availability of high explosives on such a large scale, they could have brought the normal life in the valley to a standstill. Late in 1966, Zagir, a long-standing veteran of the secret war in Kashmir, and his Pakistani intelligence handlers began setting up a new organization from the Master Cell called Al-Fatah. Inside Pakistan's military, scholar Stephen Cohen noted, interest in insurgent wars had been sparked among officers studying at United States military academies. Where the United States sought to prevent such wars, Cohen wrote, Pakistan studied these in terms of launching a people's war against India. The new group's first operation, the 1967 murder on the bridge in Navakadal, was followed by a series of robberies, including one of the Treasury of the Education Department in Pulwama and the Jammu and Kashmir Bank's Hazrat Bal branch. In the mountains of Birwa, Al-Fatah set up a training camp for new recruits. Fazl-ul-Haq Qureshi, who later on became a secessionist politician of some prominence, claimed that Al-Fatah succeeded in sending 300 cadre to training for Pakistan by 1971, recruiting via mosques across the countryside. The real problem, he said, was not cadre. It was that weapons were not available, and I quote, as Pakistan had decided that the time was not ripe to arm the jihadis. The Pakistani covert operative Salim Jahangir, who ran Al-Fatah's training camp, told Jahangir the same thing. He said that large caches of carbines did exist, but the operative who held the weapons had strict instructions not to give them to Al-Fatah until he received authorization from Pakistan's covert services. Why was that authorization held back? The war of 1971 was looming, and as Pakistan's energies focused on the east, they did not want a problem in the west. In themselves, Jahangir wrote in his diary, Al-Fatah's actions amounted to little. Their significance was setting the foundation for a long war to slowly weaken India. In his diary, he put it thus, to fight as a mosquito does while fighting with an elephant. Exceptional counterintelligence work led to Jahangir's arrest in 1972, along with other Al-Fatah members. The operation was, interestingly, led by then Deputy Superintendent of Police Ali Muhammad Watali. Watali became the first officer targeted for attack with assault rifles, which took place in 1989. Following the unraveling of Al-Fatah in 1972, New Delhi got down to the endgame. But the endgame wasn't shooting or jailing these terrorists. It was turning them to its side. After India's victory in the war of 1971, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi capitalized on her strength to negotiate a deal with Kashmir's tallest leader, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah. Abdullah agreed to some limited political autonomy for Jammu and Kashmir in return for renouncing his demand for a plebiscite on the state's future once and for all. Inside Kashmir itself, Chief Minister Sadiq's successor in office, Syed Mir Qasim, began negotiating with Al-Fatah's jailed operatives. He used the services of the officer who broke the network, Pir Ghulam Hassan Shah. Those charged with minor crimes were released. The rest were provided with special facilities for their education and care at the central prison in Srinagar. Later, Chief Minister Qasim wrote, I was upset at the crimes they had committed. But I was after all a father and therefore could not take refuge under the cold crime and punishment principle. I told the State Assembly on March 25, 1972, I can swear that I suffer the same pain as do the parents of these young people. The psychological, emotional operation worked. In 1975, the bulk of Al-Fatah's cadre went mainstream. They formed the Inqilabi Mahaz or Revolutionary Union, which supported the Indira Gandhi-Sheikh Abdullah agreement. A small group of dissidents led by Fazl-ul-Haq Qureshi actually held out against that deal, but they became politically marginalized. Eventually, they also turned. Fazl-ul-Haq Qureshi wrote thus, long years of absence from employment had made a major dent on my financial status, and with children to raise, I wanted to stay in a job. He resigned his position in the Secessionist People's League. In return, the government dropped his prosecution. For the best part of 2 decades, Kashmir was quiet. Until Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's rigging of the 1987 elections again led the legitimacy of the political system to collapse. Like an earlier generation of radicals had done in the 1960s, a new youth cohort again turned to secessionism. As New Delhi plans its next steps in Kashmir, it's time for national leaders to reopen this long Kashmir file and contemplate its lessons. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint.